welcome to Better World Technology webinar navigating cyber threat landscape, strategies for business and nonprofit executives. I'm Matthew Bauer, co-founder and evangelist at Better World Technology, and I'm joined by my colleague and our general manager, John Jordan. Hello, John.
Thanks, Matt. We're excited to bring this great content to our customers, as well as business and nonprofit executives across the U.S. I want to give a special thanks to our partner, ConnectWise, for their leadership in helping to put this series together. Thanks, ConnectWise. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, John. Over the next hour, you'll hear from one of the country's leading experts in cybersecurity, Jim Peterson, and learn about cyber threats and how the latest cybersecurity technologies can protect your organization. Some of the topics he'll cover include the history and progression of cyber threats, how organizations like yours are at risk, best practices to protect your organization, as well as business continuity and backup strategies. Please submit any questions you have throughout the presentation into the chat, and Jim, after Jim finishes, will take some Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jim Peterson. Jim is a principal solution advisor at ConnectWise. He brings more than 25 years of MSP industry experience focused on securing and protecting the SMB market through assessment, remediation, and alignment to compliance standards such as PCI, CMMC, and SOC 2 Type 1 and 2. Welcome, Jim.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew. I appreciate that. Yeah, so we got a quick slide of me here. Matthew already went through all that stuff, so we'll just go right into the presentation. So our goal today is really just to get an understanding of the threat landscape, what's going on in the cybersecurity world, who the bad actors are, what they're doing, and how we protect against them. We'll start with just a general conversation around cybersecurity, because technically it's the practice of protecting systems, networks, and programs from digital attacks. But we know it's grown a lot over the last few years because business reputation, employee information, and client information are at risk from our own environments. So we really need to have an additive approach to cybersecurity of not just protecting systems and by using tools, but by looking at the holistic environment to make sure we're protecting more than just our systems. And when we talk about cybersecurity, a lot of times the tools get the spotlight. We think of MDR or EDR. We'll get into those terms here in a little bit, or all the general security solutions that are out there. And we skip over things like process and people, because we can have the tool, but if we don't know how we maintain and update it, and we don't know how we respond when there is an issue, or who's going to do it, we're really at a deficit on responding properly to a cyber attack or incident. We also want to make sure we add in BCDR solutions, because at the end of the day, nothing's 100%. And if we can't recover an environment, we are completely at the mercy of the bad actors. So we have to be able to recover and make sure our business can continue to operate. And last but not least is assessments. A lot of times assessments start at the beginning of a relationship, but they need to be continual, so that we understand changes in the environment. We can make sure we're doing the right cyber tools, processes, we have the right people involved, and we're protecting it in the right way. Now, a little bit of history. So if we look at some of the past cyber threats, you can look across this continuum and say, yeah, I've heard of some of these. Maybe you haven't heard of all of them. Email attacks are really prevalent. AI-assisted attacks are really prevalent today. But they change and morph over time. We look at all of these. At some point, we've stopped them in the cybersecurity world, but they've been recreated and re-injected to attack and bypass the technologies that we created. So we know that these will continue to evolve over time. So malware attack, botnet attacks, social attacks, they're continually being rebuilt to bypass whatever security mechanisms we put in place. So we got to understand these, and the next step is to understand how we're defending them, right? But before we jump into that, there's a few terms that are pretty critical to the cybersecurity world. That's event, incident, and breach. We think of events as going on all the time. There are millions of events every minute of every day. It's the attempt to bypass a level of security. Now, luckily, we have a lot of solutions in place that block and stop those and defend against events. But every once in a while, the right event will get through and create an incident. And what that really means is an event has bypassed a layer of security. but has not gotten to digital information at that point. So we have a layered security approach. If we bypass one, we have an incident. The real bad one, right, the one we want to avoid using even the term for is breach, though. And that means an event has bypassed enough of our security standards to get to the data and modify it, read it, exfiltrate it, or delete it. So the breach is the one word that we don't want to use. We want to make sure whenever we have something happen in the cybersecurity world that we only call it an event until someone who has a lot more understanding of the world or is able to define a breach, because it has technical and legal meaning. So just be careful of that term as we're going through this. Now, looking at we know a little bit about the history of attacks. Looking at the history of security solutions, we look at this continuum, and what's different a little about the security solutions themselves is while every vector of attack will change and morph over time, security solutions try to do the same thing, but oftentimes they've kind of reached a potential. They've reached the maximum amount of security that they can provide. Antivirus is a really good example of this. Antivirus was the long-standing threat detector and eliminator for end user machines. But in today's world, antiviruses that only really detect known vulnerabilities just can't keep up with the threats. So we've had to move to things like EDR and MDR. And a lot of times this screen here is something that small businesses struggle with a little bit because we continually add solutions on, and unfortunately we have to add them because the threats continue to add, and we have to put new solutions in place to defend against those new threats. Now, so we know a little bit of the history. Who are the bad actors? So we kind of have three categories that we'll work with: solo hackers, nation states, and organized crime units. Now, in today's world, the organized crime units are the significant attackers, and typically where we're paying money to whenever we see an incident or breach. It's the nation states are normally going after large IP or trade secrets, and the solo hackers, historically, the war game style person just aren't getting the attack vectors, or they're not getting through as much as they used to. So we see most of our breaches and incidents come from organized crime. Now, these organized crime units are businesses with reputations. They have HR departments, they do recruiting. So this is a very sophisticated environment where they are built to try and get your money. And the only source of income they have is the extortion, the sale, and the ransom of your data. They know that your data is very important to you. That's why it's so valuable to them. So if we know who they are, how do they get in? Now, we've identified that roughly 80% of incidents and breaches, meaning they bypassed a level of security, are people-based. We've done something to allow them into our environment. Roughly 50% of the time is credentials. We've given up some username and password, and they've been able to access the environment. Now, our number one solution for a credential breach is multi-factor authentication. If we look at multi-factor authentication, what that does is it adds a secondary level of authentication to our username and password. Things like password reuse. We've used passwords on multiple sites. If one of those sites get breached, they can find your password for the other system. Multi-factor authentication helps defend against that because it's requiring a secondary authentication, not just your username and password to access information or the site. The second most common one is phishing. So we hear about phishing a lot, and you've probably learned quite a bit through your security awareness training to tell us that we don't click links, right? It's a very common vector. In fact, our inboxes are typically filled with the mix of advertisements, good email, and then often some malicious email. Now, email filters help filter out a majority of our phishing attacks, but it's still a very prevalent method of gaining access because something will slip through. Like we said, those email attacks will continue to morph over time and bypass our email filter from time to time. So we have to rely on our security awareness training to identify the challenges in any given email and stop us from clicking the link. Now, the third most common means of access for a bad actor is an exploit. Now, we'll just define an exploit as a vulnerability in hardware or software. And typically system or OS patching comes in to fill that gap and eliminate the exploit. But there are times where assessments are really critical because we may have deployed technology a few years ago and it's now in the wrong spot, or we have some vulnerabilities upstream from that appliance that has made it more of a vulnerable solution on the back end. So understanding how assessments and patching align to eliminate exploits is a critical piece in making sure we have a good holistic cybersecurity solution. So if we know who they are, right, we mostly are working with organized crime units. We know how they get in, typically end user credentials or some sort of end user access like clicking a link. What do they do, right? So it's kind of the common question, what do bad actors actually do inside an environment? And once, so we start with a cyber attack or an event, it gets through into breach mode, right? And the bad actor now has access to the environment. The first thing they'll typically do is an investigation. They want to understand what type of data is on the network and what type of information is in that data. So do we have PII? Do we have intellectual property? Do we have just general private data information? They want to know as much as they can about the information. At the end of the day, all of these steps are leveraged to maximize the payout. Whether they're going to do a ransom, whether they're going to do an extortion, or whether they're going to sell your data, they're going to focus on what's going to return the most money. Because if we think of those organized crime units, like we talked about a minute ago, their primary source of revenue is the extortion, ransom, or sale of your data. It's the only source of revenue they have, so they need to maximize that. And so by following these steps, it helps them find the best path for the most money. So investigating, they may even go as far as saying, let's see if we can find your cybersecurity insurance policy, find out what your premiums are, what your maximum payouts are, so they can work towards negotiating the majority of the money on that plan. So once they've investigated, they found out your cybersecurity policy, they found out what type of information you have, their first step is going to be to exfiltrate the data. They want to take it and pull it offsite. So if we get in the middle of this and stop this attack after we find out they've started exfiltrating data, they can still leverage ransom or data sale. So they want that to try and maximize that payout. So they'll take as much as they can. Then they'll move into BCDR manipulation. So they want to make it so you can't restore your data. And unfortunately, this happens too many times, right? This is a very often occurrence where the BCDR system or the backup system is on the same network with the same authentication as the primary network. So a bad actor gets in, elevates their privileges, they find the backup, they can destroy the backup, they can encrypt the solution, they can change the jobs. Once they get elevated access, they can do a lot of bad things. So it's where a good BCDR solution comes into play. But if they can manipulate that, now they've kind of elevated the game, right? They have your data. You can't recover from an attack, and that's when they'll go into production manipulation. Now, this may be encryption, this may be deletion, this may be modification. It can be a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, they're going to do some level of denial of service to the data so that you can't get to it. And that's when the ransom request comes in. So if we think about the steps, they're understanding your data, they're taking your data, they're making it so you can't recover, and then they're modifying your production. And all of this typically happens over roughly 200 days. Now, some are much shorter. If we think of a typical business email compromise, that can be days or shorter. But a large scale attack typically takes quite a bit of time because there are a lot of steps that go beyond this kind of stair-step approach because elevated access, finding the data, it can take a lot of time. But at the end of the day, going all the way through this will maximize the payout for any ransom request. Now, it won't be surprising. So if we know who they are, we know how they get in, we know what they do, it won't be surprising why they do it, right? Financial results are typical to almost every ransom request. They want to be paid. And we had roughly $10.3 billion paid out in 2022, up from 6.9 in 2021. Now, the interesting fact here is this is the number reported to the FBI. So anytime there's a breach that requires reporting, the FBI will consume that information and spit it back out to the rest of the world so we understand the impact of cybercrime in our world. But this does not include events or breaches or payouts that were swept under the rug, that were not required to be submitted to the FBI. A lot of small businesses who are ransomed or extorted for $50,000, $100,000. A lot of times they'll try to sweep it under the rug. They don't want to notify their competition, their clients, their teams that anything happened. They're embarrassed. They don't want their reputational damage. So while this is the payout number, it's just a part of the overall cost of cybercrime in our world. Because even in addition to that, we have legal fees, we have lost business, we have lots of challenges that impact our economy beyond just the payout. So it's big dollars we're talking about. Now, what about AI? So we hear about AI a lot, and the challenging part of AI is that it turns anyone into a sophisticated hacker. If we looked at one of those first few slides, we had solo hacker, nation states, and organized crime. All of them are using AI to improve their attacks. They're using AI to create ransom emails. They're using AI to create PowerShell scripts and programming to improve their attacks. It really lowers the barrier to be able to do a sophisticated attack, similar to ransomware as a service where I just pay someone to attack for me. So it's, while we said that solo hacker isn't as prevalent as it used to be, it is increasing in their impact because they can create a script to take over a computer in a few minutes with an AI assisted program and send it out to a couple million people in a few minutes. It's allowed the vector to change significantly and just make that solo hacker even more effective. Still not as effective as organized crimes just because of the size of the organized crimes companies overseas, but it's really increasing their ability to breach and extract financial gains. Now, so if we looked at this, we said, we know who they are, we know what they do, we know how they get in, we know AI is helping them. What's our standard? How do we protect ourselves? And we'll often talk about a layered approach. And at the end of the day, what a layered approach does is help us keep events to an incident at the maximum. So we know if we can bypass one level of technology, we're sitting in an incident, but our goal is to keep bad actors away from our data. So if we said something like a front end, middle end, and back end solution, so that we're trying to protect all layers. Our front end are going to be things like managed detection and response, DNS and web filtering, email filtering, security awareness training. Our middle end is going to be things like access management and SIM and SOC. And our back end is going to be BCDR and unfortunately cybersecurity insurance. Because as we saw, if that BCDR solution is compromised, we have to lean back on our cyber insurance policy to help us pay for the restoration and become whole again. But if we look at the front, middle, and back end of security, we can protect from outside events that happen to our end users. We can attack slow down an attack if something's bypassed with access management and then notifying it with SIM and SOC. And then worst case, from the resiliency side, if we have to recover, we have a good solid BCDR solution to recover data and restore systems. Now, MDR, getting into the specific terms on a couple of the technologies that we use, managed detection and response. So historically, managed detection and response has grown from other solutions. We talked a little bit about AV, antivirus, and how it stops known threats a little earlier. So antivirus stops known threats, and that just wasn't enough because a lot of times bad actors would execute scripts on machines that would do unknown activity. We had to create solutions like EDR, endpoint detection and response. Endpoint detection and response does two things. It stops known and unknown threats. It looks at the activity on a system to determine, is this real? Should I be allowing this to happen? Does this create threats on the computer or on the network? And will stop activity that it deems to be suspicious. Now, MDR, which is a term that's thrown around a lot, just adds the managed layer to it. So endpoint detection and response, or EDR, is sitting on the machine and doing its job. MDR adds the person to be able to monitor alerts that come through 24/7 by 365, typically through a security operations center or SOC. So really MDR is just EDR plus security operations center. Now, a couple other technologies that we want to leverage to try and layer our protection against. So we have the front end PC and server protection with EDR or MDR. If something were to bypass that, we need other technologies to try and stop it, that layered approach, so it stays at an incident. And one of the most common solutions is DNS and web filtering. Now, anytime an end user requests access to a website, it will typically flow through a DNS or web filtering solution. Now, that can be on-premise or it can be in the cloud. Obviously, cloud is becoming more and more prevalent in today's world, but they still have some on-premise solution. So for a good site access, an end user will request the DNS filtering solution, will allow it through to the good site. A return path will be created, and the DNS filtering solution will inspect the payload, make sure it's safe, and deliver it to the end user. Now, for us, this just looks like typing in Google and it comes right up. But for the system, it's actually looking at that traffic and the URL to make sure it's allowed and it's safe. If a bad site comes up, a user may request it. Now, a lot of times DNS and web filtering will stop traffic on the outbound side. If you have policies in place that disallow certain categories of internet traffic, it's going to stop it right at the perimeter. But if it's unsure, it will allow that traffic through, and then when the bad site returns a suspicious payload, it'll block it in its tracks. Now, while DNS and web filtering has been around for a long time, it's really one of the premier solutions to stop bad activities and click linked access for in any environment. Next technology, probably one of the other most talked about, is security awareness training, or SAT. Security awareness training is just end user training on cybersecurity issues. And almost every organization will recommend security awareness training because 80%, like we talked about, 80% of those incidents and breaches are end user related. So how do we defend against that? We talk to employees and about the risks and the challenges in the environment. We educate them on common tactics that are used to breach or gain access to a system. And we try to show them how to defend against that from an end user perspective, right? So the majority of security awareness training is that education, how to spot challenges in an email. Now, I'll say AI has really upped the game on email or business email compromise, because they can create very realistic, very unsuspicious emails that would look like you or I conversing at any time. So we have to use security awareness training to understand things like, don't click links unless you are expecting the message. Don't open files unless you're expecting the file. You know, this is a good example, this picture here, you know, dear buyer, right? This is the old school style of security awareness training, understanding a very common blank email that we would never click on, but they're getting more and more sophisticated. So we have to be more and more vigilant in not clicking links or not opening files unless we are guaranteed that we know that it's sent from that person and that it's safe. Testing is always a part of security awareness training, and something that often gets frowned upon because we're afraid that if we fail a test or that we click the wrong link, that we're going to get in trouble. But it's the only way to really validate that the education is hitting home and that we are training on the right topic. So security awareness training, one of the biggest pieces of a good holistic cybersecurity solution. Next, we have access management. We're going through a lot of technologies today in a really brief time. So we understand that this is a lot of information, but hopefully it's giving you a good idea of some of the layers that we use to protect access management. It has a simple goal in mind. It's to limit access to data unless we've validated who you are and that you need to get to it. So as in this example, right, we have Kai, who's a office manager at a business. Typically or historically, Kai would have just used their username and password and been able to access all of the data that it has rights to access. Well, access management has layered things into there to ensure Kai really is who that she says she is, and that she's using the applications that require access to that data. So things like assuring that Kai is using their assigned work computer, they're on the right local or remote network, and that they're launching or accessing the data from the right application. By adding additional layers of security or attributes to Kai's profile, we can ensure that the finance and HR data is protected until that right application is actually launched. So if Kai was ever breached, if somebody ever took remote access of Kai's machine, they wouldn't have default access to those files, you know, until that application is lost, just increasing the security and limiting the footprint of data that's available to bad actors. Next, we have SIM and SOC, and SIM and SOC has been around for a long time, but it's really increased in its use of in protection of small businesses because of its impact. Now, SIM stands for Security Information and Event Monitoring, and SOC, just similar to MDR, is our Security Operations Center. So what a SIM does is takes data from all of your solutions and correlates it together into a single location so that it can look both for events and for correlated events. So if we have a singular event on an appliance, or we have multiple events across appliances, it can trigger and notify the SOC that an issue has happened. So it's going to pull all of that data into the SIM solution and have it in one place so it can be cross-referenced and stored for historical purposes. Now, if we look at SIM and SOC in action, a typical business user or example, maybe 25 users, 5 servers, a few sites, and a couple SaaS applications. One reason we've added SOC onto that is that small of an environment would create roughly 430 events per second. So there was a time when SIM originally came out that team members or IT professionals would review the logs or watch them in real time. But we've added SOC in there to do a couple of different things. Number one, to respond 24/7, 365. We want someone to be available after hours so that we can have the fastest response possible, because if SIM alerts on something, we want to know about it right away. Secondly, we want the SOC engaged because it finely tunes the SIM at all times. So SIM is a solution that gets deployed, but it has to be maintained properly, or else you'll start to get a lot of false positive alerts coming in. And then alert fatigue kicks in and we miss some critical alerts. So the SOC maintains and responds. So two critical pieces in this SOC solution. Now, a simple example of how this works in the real world. A user logs into a SaaS app from LA. Let's call it Microsoft 365. Nothing special. Microsoft 365 sends the event of logging into the SIM. Nothing happens because that's normal activity. At the same time, the same user logs into the same SaaS app from another location. We'll say it's in the UK here. This is a problem, right? So now when Microsoft 365 sends that event over to the SIM, it's going to alert and say, hey, we've had impossible travel identified. There is no way for a user to log in from LA and the UK at the same time. And if there is a way to do it, we still want to be notified on it. So the SIM will now notify the SOC that we need to take some action. We need to change passwords, disable account, and notify the user or team. We need to do this because we've identified that there's a real challenge with authentication and somebody's probably getting in that shouldn't be getting in. Now, so that was our kind of middleware side. Now we go to the backend side. How do we protect an environment from the restoration side? We talk about BCDR a lot, and it's a term that gets abused at times to mean different things. When we talk about BCDR, we're saying, hey, how do we recover from a disaster? And that could be a ransomware attack. It could be an environmental problem. How do we recover from a disaster and continue to operate our business continuity? It's a really important function here because a lot of times this gets confused with backup, and it's so much more than that. And in our world today, data is everywhere. So a good BCDR solution is not just going to protect the old school data. It's going to look for data and try to build processes and people's tasks around finding where data is. Data, as we've moved into a more remote workforce and purchased more and more SaaS applications, our data footprint and the locations that can be saved is growing significantly every day. On top of that, from a security perspective, the location that secure data can be stored at is growing every day. I may get an email with some PII in it. I throw it in my OneDrive and then I share it with somebody else. That data can now be found in multiple locations. So how do we secure and how do we know which one should be protected? A complete BCDR solution will evaluate data to make sure we're backing up the right things at all times. Now, when we look at the foundation of a BCDR solution from the backup perspective, we're going to typically say most backup solutions and BCDR solutions should follow 3-2-1. 3 copies of your data on 2 different platforms, one of those being offsite. We add the plus in there because we want proper configuration. 321 doesn't help us when it's on the same network, or we don't have the right recovery points, or we're not getting all of the data. We want to make sure proper configuration and proper processes are deployed to make sure we're protecting data at all times. A little walkthrough here would show our three, right? So we have 3 copies of the data. We have our production, our local backup for fast restore, and our offsite backup for disaster. We want to make sure that there's a geographic distance between our local backup and offsite backup, because if something happens to our facility where our production and local backup reside, we want to make sure we can recover from a geographically distant location. In addition, as our production data grows over time, we want to make sure that that is replicated to local and offsite backup. A lot of times our SaaS applications are not truly backed up, and we need to make sure we're pulling that down, because that's really business critical data. If you think of our email, our OneDrive, and our SharePoint, while they are protected in the Microsoft world, having a backup copy of those will ensure we're truly following 321 across all data in our organization. Now, one risk that we have with any backup environment is that breach question. If someone were to get through to our production data, can they get to our local and our offsite data repositories? We have to do something called immutable storage, which really means it cannot be destroyed or modified from the production world. By doing immutable storage, we can ensure that our local backup and our offsite backup are available when we need them, especially if there were a ransom event or a cyber attack on our production environment. And last but not least, we have to make sure that we have adequate performance from our offsite backup in case we ever had to restore that data to our production environment. A lot of times we'll use very slow offsite storage because of the cost benefit. But if we can't store it in the time frame that we need to run our business, it can be a very big challenge. So understanding this piece of it is really critical in the worst case scenario. Now, we'll a lot of times talk about foundational security items. We've talked about many different technologies, but if I had to pick a handful of cybersecurity solutions to implement, what's going to give me the biggest bang for the buck? And we'll talk about these 5 real quick. EDR, MDR, the front end solution to protect endpoints from malicious user access. The endpoint detection response and hopefully managed detection response are the #1 thing we can do to protect end user access in computers. MFA, another quick second here, will help end users protect their accounts, access to systems. So everything that can have MFA should have MFA, even if it's an inconvenience, right? MFA significantly increases the protection of an account. When we talked about 80% of access to or breaches and incidents occur from end user, 49% of that being credential based. This drops that 49% down to about 1%. So we can eliminate 48% of incidents and breaches just by applying MFA. Third is security awareness training, and having end users understand what the risks are in their environment and how they can defend against them. Fourth is the access management piece. Limiting visibility to data until someone truly needs it will significantly improve a cybersecurity stance by allowing or disallowing access to bad actors who cannot qualify for the data access. And last, of course, is BCDR, business continuity and disaster recovery. Having a truly great BCDR solution that is tested at least annually to ensure that you can truly recover from the environment in the time frame that you need. Now, why do we care about BCDR so much? We do know that backup is just not enough. Having a copy of your data does not mean it's 100% recoverable. We have to test it out. We have to have the policies and processes in place and people in place to make sure that we can recover when we need it. It is the last line of defense. Now, cybersecurity is trying to take that award away from BCDR, because if BCDR is manipulated, we have to fall back on our cybersecurity policy. But from a data perspective, it's the last line of defense, and we have to be able to recover, not just from a ransom or an environmental disaster, but just from accidental recovery. We have to have a good way of restoring data when we need it. Data is growing everywhere, so while BCDR includes a process to discover and find data wherever it's hiding and understand what we need to back up and ensure we have it protected, because the financial impact of lost data is significant. Now, wrapping this all up, one thing that we hear quite a bit in our world is that small business doesn't believe that they're a target for cybersecurity issues. And they kind of contradict each other, because one of the challenges of small businesses not believing they're a target is that they don't typically invest in the right cyber tools, processes, and people. So they become a bigger target. It's kind of a self-building, unfortunate solution here. So understanding that small businesses and all businesses are a target. If you have data that you want to protect and you have the ability and willingness to pay to keep that data either secret or private or available, you are a target. And by not investing in technology, it actually increases your visibility and the ability for bad actors to access it in your environment. Building a layered defense is the best way to protect any cyber environment or any internal environment. By making sure we have multiple layers, we can turn that event into a maximum of an incident and hopefully avoid that breach. And knowing your risks. So understanding the risks specific to your company is probably the most critical thing beyond understanding that you're a target, because the way your technology is deployed, how you use it, the industry you're in, the data you have, all of those help somebody understand how to protect or how to attack your environment. So knowing your risks through assessments and conversations can help you build the right layer defense to avoid being a target and minimize your availability in that world. All right, from there, we've hit all the technology. I'll hand it back over to Matthew to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, Jim, that was great. I mean, what a incredible 360 view on cybersecurity threats, where it's come from, where it's going, and we're really excited to be able to present this to our customers and the wider community of nonprofit and business executives that are tuned in. And I know we have some questions. And John, do you want to lead that off if you have one or two that seem appropriate?
Thanks, Matt. Jim, there's been a handful of folks who've asked a couple of questions that looks about, just giving a little bit of an explanation about, cybersecurity insurance, what they may or may not need, and how important is it really?
Oh, it's a great question. And it's a challenging question at times to answer, because everybody's cybersecurity insurance needs are a little bit different. If we simplify it and talk about, hey, there's the policy, the dollar spend out side of things. That's going to be a little bit of a mix of your revenue per day and a few other considerations to understand. And a cybersecurity insurance professional can get you the policy limits that you're going to want. But from a cybersecurity stance, we know that there's a few things that you can do to maximize your policy. And when I say maximize your policy, we're doing two things. We're limiting the cost of the policy, and we're limiting the potential use of the policy. And we talked about those 5 things that you can do. So we have MDR, managed detection and response. We have multi-factor authentication. We have access management. We have BCDR. We want it by leveraging, and security awareness training, by leveraging those, we can minimize the cost of our insurance policy and maximize the ability for it not to be used. One other point that we'll see a lot from a cybersecurity insurance world is the difference between a true cybersecurity insurance policy and a rider on your typical business insurance. Now, we normally would recommend that small business access or purchase a complete cybersecurity insurance policy, because typically the riders have a lot of limitation. They may have a $200 or $300 maximum payout, but a lot of times that'll be broken down into specific sections for remediation, for legal, for ransom. And so the holistic use of that isn't as effective, because a lot of times it's not enough money in one area and a little too much money in another area. So knowing which one you have and knowing which one works for you is a critical step.
Thanks, Jim. Matt, that's looks like all the questions for the moment.
Okay, great. Well, Jim, thank you, John, and to everybody who was attending today and who will see this in the future. Please, if we're not already working with you, stop by betterworldtechnology.com and click on contact us, and we will start a conversation about how we can bring all this wisdom and services to your organization to get you out ahead of the cyber threat landscape. And thanks again to ConnectWise and Jim for this amazing presentation. And we look forward to doing more in the series. And thank you all for attending. And we'll be putting more content out soon. And appreciate everyone's time and wisdom here today. Thank you.